It's a hot and sunny Saturday here in Rotherham, and today I brought the mobile television studio to Herringthorpe Playing Fields. Herringthorpe Playing Fields is this big field in Rotherham, about a mile outside of the town centre. I've come here for a bit of peace and quiet. We've got some fairly busy roads surrounding it, and there's people playing football and walking dogs around, but there are not a lot of people, and it's quite nice and peaceful. I've managed to find a little quiet spot, which is ideal for doing video. I'm desperately hoping that last bit of video was in focus. Anyway, I've come to make this video because I wanted to tell my story about my diagnosis of Aspergers Syndrome. Back in 2005, 17 years ago, I was diagnosed with a disease called Aspergers Syndrome. Now, Aspergers Syndrome is a type of autism. It's a psychiatric condition, or some people consider it a neurological condition. It doesn't really matter. It's something that affects your brain, basically. To cut a very long story short, it affects social communication, imagination, things of that nature, and can cause anxiety and other sorts of conditions like that. But I was diagnosed with it 17 years ago, and I thought I'd tell my story. It can be quite controversial. Sometimes the diagnosis itself is controversial, sometimes the treatments for it are controversial. Some people's opinions on it are controversial. A lot of fighting between different patients. And often, with thanks to the internet, people like myself take advantage of the internet and also books and newspapers to tell our stories, like I'm doing now. And unfortunately for me, my story is a lot more upsetting. The ones you hear in the media or on the television tend to be those who have overcome the problems, they've got jobs, they've got families. You get people like Greta Thunberg, for instance, who considers it a superpower. She was diagnosed with Aspergers Syndrome and she considers it to be a superpower. My story's not that. It's not a superpower for me. It's quite disabling at times. It results in a lot of anxiety. It's led to other mental health conditions. And the diagnosis story itself is quite upsetting. I don't know the best way to describe it, but the word traumas comes up quite a bit. I think it may well be described as traumatic, and that's had a lasting effect on my life. So here's my story. If you've seen any of my videos before, you'll know I tend to go more for professionally produced videos, although here I'm just sat talking in front of a camera and I do have notes. In fact, these notes are actually a forum topic which I made a while back, where I actually told this story in writing and actually got some feedback from various people who read it, so I'll talk about that now. So I'll tell you how my diagnosis of Aspergers syndrome came about. You hear a lot about late diagnosis and people who are diagnosed as adults, but in theory Aspergers syndrome and even classical autism is something that's supposed to be diagnosed when you're a child. Well, for me, I was somewhere in between. I was diagnosed age 14, which was in 2005. I actually grew up with relatively few problems. I wasn't always liked by people, and I wasn't very social, but I had interests, and I kind of got on okay with people, even though I didn't really have friends. So it was, it was manageable. I don't know if anyone thought there was anything wrong with me. Apparently my mum did at some point, but that was sort of ruled out. But when I was 14, I got a lot of harassment. I'd done okay at comprehensive school. I got decent grades. I didn't really get on with people, but I was tolerated by people. But then I started getting a lot of harassment by teachers. I was put on school report, I was regularly told off, and I'd done nothing wrong. No one could actually figure out what I'd done wrong. In fact, the reason I consider this to be harassment is that I kept having teachers complaining that I was on report and complaining that I was getting detentions because they saw this well-behaved boy who was doing either very well or in some cases at least adequate in his schoolwork, but he was constantly getting told off and constantly on report, and they couldn't see why. And I couldn't see why either. So that's why I consider it harassment. I was basically being humiliated by all the constant tellings off and the constant reports, and I'd not done anything wrong. Now, this harassment had caused me to become very, very suspicious of people, very suspicious of my parents, very suspicious of the form tutor and the head of year and certain other school staff. But then, of course, I ended up getting a medical appointment. I was given an appointment with a consultant child psychiatrist at the psychiatry clinic just down the road here in Rotherham Town Centre. It's not a clinic there anymore, it's that the psychiatry moved out some time ago. I don't know where they are now, but for many years it was in Rotherham Town Centre at Chatham House. And this is the first upsetting part, and I'm reluctant to talk about it on camera because it's quite upsetting for me. I was made aware of it, but I cancelled the appointment. Because I'd become very suspicious of everyone, I didn't really know what it was for, and I took steps to cancel it. But they rebooked it for a couple of days later and didn't tell me about it. And then someone came and got me out of my class. It was actually Mr. Clay's biology class, and said, make sure you bring your bag, Stephen, you won't be coming back. Which sounds quite sinister in this situation, but I indeed didn't go back to Mr. Clay's biology class that day, but I did go back to school, so nothing to worry about. I didn't end up being forced into hospital or anything. But I was then forcibly dragged down to the psychiatry clinic by my mother, and that was very difficult for me. It was very upsetting. I seem to recall I was crying, and it was I sort of trying to do as much as I possibly could to get out of it, whilst trying to do sort of enough to stop her from doing anything that might be considered violent. She's not the most violent of people, but she certainly wants to threaten violence. But we got to the clinic, and I refused to go in. I refused to go in the building. And eventually the consultant psychiatrist actually came outside and spoke to me, and he must have actually been quite good at his job, because he actually managed to coax me to go inside. So yeah, I ended up having the appointment. I don't know how long it was there for. You sometimes hear people talk about autism diagnosis, and they say it lasts many hours. I don't think mine was many hours. It was probably 2 hours at the most, and I'd say probably more likely to be an hour, or maybe even less. I don't know. I can't remember. But it was a very unpleasant and a very stressful hour. We'll say an hour for the sake of argument. It was a very unpleasant and very stressful hour, and in that hour they basically were talking about virtually everything that was they considered to be wrong with me, and everything that they didn't like about me. And I'd not really been told what this appointment was actually for. The psychiatrist kept saying that this is why I think it's Aspergers Syndrome rather than autism. No one really said what I was there for. But he made the diagnosis of Aspergers Syndrome after me spending the best part of an hour trying not to cry, which is very difficult and very embarrassing when you're a 14-year-old teenager. It made this diagnosis, and he wanted to tell my school about it, and I refused. I always was a very private person. I still am to an extent. But he wanted to tell them, and I said no, but they kept going on and on and on and on and on about it, until I eventually gave in, and that they deemed acceptable consent under the Data Protection Act. So the school were notified, although they didn't tell any other students, I'm pleased to say, and having seen the records since then, they did explicitly say that it's not to be disclosed beyond staff. And I think they managed that, so I'm at least grateful for something there. So now I've got this diagnosis of Asperger's Syndrome, what do you do about it? Well, firstly, what actually is Asperger's Syndrome? I've just told you, but I'm a 30-year-old man now, and I've read books about it, I've read websites about it, and I've had many years of experience. At this point, I was a 14-year-old boy. I'd never really even heard of the thing. I'd heard of its existence, but didn't really know much about it. And no one ever stopped to actually tell me what Asperger's Syndrome was. You know, in all this harassment at school and a GP appointment and the psychiatrist appointment, not one person ever stopped to tell me what Asperger's Syndrome actually is. But I was referred to a therapist who took a special interest in autism, and that was mixed. I think I went about 6 times, and the first few were with my mum and dad, and that was them mostly moaning. That meant I couldn't really say anything. It was mostly a case of dictating how I must live my life now that I've been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. And there was no actual explanation for what was going on. And then as for school, the harassment I'd suffered previous to that stopped, but then I got different harassment, and this was now following the diagnosis, because now I officially have special needs and have to be treated as though I'm an invalid. Yeah, basically, people had read about Asperger's syndrome and autism in books, maybe taken professional advice, I don't know, but basically they couldn't see me as just me anymore. They wanted me to conform basically to what they thought an Asperger's syndrome patient should be. Now, I also read a book at the time, and I think other people had read this book. It was Tony Attwood's book. Actually a very good book. Now I read it as an adult, it's actually a very informative book. But I don't think people actually took it as an informative book. They took it as an instruction manual and said, like, this is how an Asperger's syndrome patient is supposed to behave. This is how they should be treated. This is how they should be educated. And the whole thing became very dictatorial. No one wanted me to be me. It was a case of dictating what I must do now. That was what people's idea of treatment was. And at this point, no one had really explained to me what Asperger's syndrome was, and I'd never had the opportunity to even discuss it with a professional. Yeah, I never had the opportunity to discuss the diagnosis or my supposed symptoms or any help with a professional. I was never given the opportunity to see a doctor or other health professional and discuss this diagnosis in confidence and in a polite and respectful manner with them. I was never given that opportunity, and I didn't actually have that opportunity until 2019, which was 14 years after I was diagnosed. So if we move on to 2006, when I was age 15, I actually developed symptoms of what I now know to be depression. I was sad all the time, I was crying regularly. I'd come home and cry about things, and even quite often started thinking of suicide a lot. Turns out this is actually quite common for Asperger's syndrome, for people to suffer from depression, but given the way I was treated in relation to the Asperger's syndrome diagnosis, I think it's actually not that surprising in hindsight that I actually did start to suffer from depression. And I couldn't seek treatment for it. I had no trust whatsoever in the medical profession, and I didn't have any friends, and I didn't have supportive family or anything of that nature, so I couldn't easily seek any help for that. So it wasn't until long after school and long after college that I actually sought some help for it. It was when I was 20 in 2011 that I went to see a doctor, just a general practitioner, and got some antidepressants, and they actually made a big difference. I ended up taking those for several years, and they were actually very helpful. I'd had several different ones over the years, varying levels of competence, of course, from different doctors, and some doctors prefer tablets, some prefer therapy, some prefer one type of medication, some prefer another, but generally speaking they all helped. but I'd still never had the opportunity to actually talk to anyone properly about the Aspergers syndrome. Doctors would acknowledge it, and they'd be happy to write me a sick note for the job centre if I needed one, but I never had the opportunity to discuss it with anyone. And therapy had never occurred to me because the books I'd read suggested not bothering with therapy because we have trouble talking about things and talking to people and talking about feelings. You should perhaps not have therapy because it might make matters worse. And I kind of agreed with those books. So I never looked into therapy, and no one ever suggested anything autism specific until I got a new doctor in 2018. My last doctor was an NHS doctor, and they became very incompetent and couldn't provide repeat prescriptions, and they'd lose them, and I kept having to go without tablets and was going through a heck of a lot of stress and uncertainty over whether or not I'd get them. And I was on a particular medication which was notorious for its withdrawal effects if you stop it, and they wouldn't deal with complaint letters, and I'd say they were generally just incompetent and uncaring in the end. But I eventually made the decision to stop taking the antidepressants. I tried to wean myself off them. This one I was on was venlafaxine, which is, if you know anything about them, is probably one of the worst for stopping taking it. But I couldn't manage it. The withdrawal effects were so bad. The depression started to come back, and the symptoms, it was just not the slightest bit tolerable. So eventually I just said, after doing this for about a month or two, I just said, Stephen, you're going to have to find a new doctor. So I did. I found a new doctor, and this happened to be someone in the private sector who, until a few years later at least, was actually very good, and actually quite cheap as far as doctors go. He changed the medication back to a different one which I'd had before, but we got talking about therapy, and he said, have you considered seeing an autism-specific therapist, a therapist who specialises in autism? Which never occurred to me. Now, I don't know if that's just an idea he had off the top of his head, or if he'd dealt with patients who've seen specialist therapists before. I don't know, but he suggested that, and I thought this might be a decent idea. So we looked into it, and it turned out there's a dedicated clinic that does just that over just down the road in Sheffield. So he referred me, and they refused to see me on bureaucratic grounds, so we had to abandon that. But then, about a year later, in 2019, I looked into it privately and found a self-employed therapist. There are a few autism-specific therapists around, it turns out. But I found one who had not long since started in private practice, and I went to see her, and she was very good. She was very, very caring, very understanding of the situation. She worked with autistic people in a job, and she had autistic people in her family, so she was quite used to us, and she knew a lot about it, and that was actually very beneficial. And one of the interesting things that she said to me was that when you start counselling autistic people, you have to sort of tear up the rule book. So if you study counselling as an academic subject at college or university, and I think she was qualified in psychology, don't quote me on that, but I think she was. She said, the moment you start dealing with autistic people, you have to tear up the rule book. Anyway, that might be why that might be why the autism-specific therapy was actually very good. And then, of course, COVID-19 happened, and she packed it in the moment that started, and never reopened. So, 14 years after being diagnosed with Aspergers Syndrome, I went to see a therapist and saw a therapist for a few months, and then it got stopped due to Aspergers Syndrome. She never reopened. A lot of therapists, I think, eventually have reopened. Not all have, but a lot have. But I just don't want to. I'm just in a position now where after so long, I just don't want to start it again. I don't want to spend the money. It costs me a lot of money. I don't want to put the time and the effort and the money into seeing a therapist, only for them to perhaps shut in a few months' time. And as for the doctor, well, the doctor sacked me as a patient 18 months ago, forcing me to come off the tablets again. The tablets I was on, citalopram this time, were better than the venlafaxine was to come off. It doesn't have the same withdrawal effects. It does have them, but they're nowhere near as bad. And yeah, I came off. I had 2 boxes of them, so I managed to sort of wean myself off it over the course of a few months. And by May last year, I'd stopped taking them completely. But by that time, the depression symptoms had started to come back. I was a lot more anxious than I had been. I was sad all the time, or at least regularly. I was tired all the time. For at least some time, I was struggling simply climbing up the stairs at times. Basically, all that's carried on till now. It's just over a year since I was completely free of the antidepressants, and after being on the tablets for a decade, it was quite an achievement to stop taking them. But these symptoms are just so... The symptoms of the depression are just so bad that it's to be honest, it's hardly tolerable. You know, the depression never actually went away, because some people take the tablets for a while and that fixes it. Didn't in my case. I took them for a whole decade, and you know, it still hasn't fixed it. I came off them and the depression came back. You know, still now I'm struggling with being tired regularly, crying a lot, feeling suicidal a lot. It's just very difficult to deal with, and it is difficult to talk about as well. I don't think there's much chance of finding any more professional help. I mean, doctors are actually very few and far between here in England. People will often tell you what an amazing service the NHS is with all its heroes, but it really isn't. It's the only thing it has going for it is it's free. The actual service you get is very, very poor, and people just don't want to work in it. So, you know, there's a shortage of doctors, shortage of nurses, shortage of just about everyone. So it's very difficult to actually get any kind of treatment on the NHS. So that's basically my diagnosis story. I've not talked about work, I've not talked about college, I've not talked about life in general. I've just really talked about the diagnosis. And yeah, it's actually quite an upsetting story for me, and it's quite upsetting to think about it. And unfortunately, I never really recovered from the whole traumatic experience that it was, and I still think about it practically every day. So I've never got over it, and I do wonder if I hadn't have had such a traumatic diagnosis, would it really have mattered? If I do genuinely have Aspergers syndrome, then you know, I would still have it whether I'm diagnosed or not, and that it may or may not have caused problems. I don't know, but it was the harassment I got at school, and the trauma from that, and the trauma from the diagnostic process, which caused me to suffer from depression. And I think, had I not have gone through all that, I probably wouldn't have got depression. Now, it's not to say I wouldn't have developed it later on in life. I might have. I honestly don't know, but it's you know, it might have led to a better experience in the last few years of school and at college. Anyway, I said I've got notes. This is actually from the Wrong Planet forum, which is a discussion board specifically for autism and Aspergers syndrome. I posted my story and I got some feedback, and I'm just going to talk about this feedback. I said, had I have not been diagnosed, it wouldn't have changed the AS if I do actually have it. But I can't help but wonder, would I have coped better had it have been done in a more dignified way? You have to bear in mind that what I've just told you, you know, my diagnosis was done in the most undignified and disrespectful way possible. There was no consent there. In fact, I'm not too knowledgeable on the laws of medical consent, but the entire medical examination that they did, that might have even been illegal when you consider medical consent laws. I mean, you actually have to consent to a medical procedure, and the fact that I cancelled the appointment and refused to go in and argued against it and severely struggled during the assessment, any sane person might take that to mean that I actually didn't consent to the assessment. So it could well have been illegal, I don't know, but one person said undoubtedly it would have been a lot better. He said what you've described is deeply unpleasant, with no explanation, no proper consent, and being given a label rather than any useful information on how you process and how to find and use your strong points. That's very good. I was indeed given a label. No one ever explained to me what it was, what it meant, or what I could do about it. I was not given any explanation at all. The next person says it's very good that I've been able to overcome the so-called help that I got. I did indeed get some help. As I've just said, I had the therapist for a few times, which was more a dictatorship rather than therapy. But I also had extra help at school, such as extra time in my exams, which I didn't need and considered to be harassment because I didn't need it. This is a distressing story filled with emotional pain. It sounds as if you got all the trauma, but without anybody actually reaching you and giving explanations, simply making demands. Yeah, to be honest, I completely agree with the person who wrote that. I think that describes what I've written very well. But she goes on to say, please don't give up looking for new tools to use to live a better life. Sending best wishes. Next one says, you only recently started to accept the diagnosis was correct and weren't convinced for a while. Do you think there might be a valid reason for that? Well, the reason for that, not necessarily that I objected to the diagnosis of Aspergers Syndrome. I think it was the whole process of the diagnosis and the way the result of the diagnosis made people treat me as basically as an invalid, and wanted to dictate to me rather than just treating me as me. I mean, no one. If you talk about the extra time in the exams, for instance, and I know that's not going to be particularly controversial, and it's hardly something to get depressed about. But no one actually ever asked me if that was helpful. No one ever said, Stephen, would you find this useful? They just did it. And this is part of the problem. You get things sort of imposed on you, whether they're helpful or not, and even if they are helpful, you're not always given any say in it, and it can cause a lack of trust in people. So that's why I didn't accept the diagnosis until perhaps some time after I actually finished college. It says, you also sound like you have a lot of PTSD going on based on what you wrote. This could mimic autism symptoms, so that suggests that there's a possibility that it could be autism or it could be PTSD. But a likely scenario, I think, is it's actually both, or at least elements of both. It says here, even if you really do have Asperger's, this type of psychological abuse can make symptoms way worse than they otherwise would have been. Yeah, I gather people with Aspergers Syndrome and autism can suffer things like post-traumatic stress, simply because of the demands of life. So problems in jobs, for instance, problems with family, problems looking after yourself. It's something people can and will be traumatised by, but I think in my case I was traumatised by the actual diagnostic procedure itself and the way I was treated as a result of it. Yeah, so I then just go on to say that I left school at 16 and I went to college, which was a much needed fresh start, and it was because at college I was treated as an adult. In fact, some of my teachers were actually quite old, and of course they will have been from the generation where you could have left school at 14 if you'd wanted to. So they were very much of the opinion that you've left school, you're 16 now, you're an adult, you're responsible for yourself. So it wasn't really possible for them to go around dictating to me based on a diagnosis like it was at school. And obviously had I stayed on a sixth form, people would have known me there, because the school teachers would have known me and they'd been in contact with parents. They know who my parents are, so I would not have been able to have a fresh start, and that fresh start I had at college was much needed for me. Anyway, that's my story for now. That's the start of it. I've started a new YouTube channel for this story series. I've told you about the diagnosis. Behind me is Rotherham Town Centre. I'm going to go and do another video about my experience of working as a person with Aspergers Syndrome and mental illness. One of my jobs was down the road in town, or at least was based in town. Actually works up in the other direction. But I will talk about the problems with work and with school and college, and also I intend to talk a lot about politics. I do quite a lot of videos on my main YouTube channel about political situations and political protests. Unfortunately, autism and mental illness is not exempt from political disputes, and lots of people argue the toss about it, so I intend to give my point of view on that as well. So do subscribe to the channel if you wish to see more, and I'll catch you in the next one.